The hardest thing I ever did was look at a photograph of myself when I was 32 years old and realize I didn't feel a single thing for that woman. Not fondness, not pity, not even recognition, just a kind of cold distance, like looking at a stranger on a bus who you'll never see again. My name is Dorothy. I'm 84 years old, and it took me most of my life to understand that the person I was the cruelest to, the most unforgiving of, the one I pushed the hardest without ever once stopping to ask if she was tired, was me. I want to talk about that today because I think some of you know exactly what I mean. Maybe you've never said it out loud. Maybe you've even told yourself it's a virtue, this relentless self-discipline, this refusal to go easy on yourself. I told myself that for decades. I was very good at making it sound like strength. I grew up in a small town in rural Virginia, the second of 5 children, in a house where feelings were not something you talked about at the dinner table. My mother was a hard woman, not because she didn't love us, but because her own life had asked so much of her that tenderness had become something of a luxury she couldn't afford. My father worked long hours and came home quiet. We were not a family that comforted each other in words. You skinned your knee, you washed it off, you kept going. You failed a test, you studied harder. You cried, you were told you'd feel better in the morning. And by the time I was 10 years old, I had absorbed all of that completely. I had learned that the appropriate response to any kind of pain, my own pain, was to push through it as quickly as possible and get back to being useful. I didn't think of it as something being taken from me. I thought of it as character building. I thought of it as learning to be strong. And for many years that belief served me well enough that I never questioned it. I married young, at 21, a man named Gerald who was kind and steady and who loved me more openly than I knew how to receive at the time. We had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, and I raised them the way I had been raised, which is to say with warmth, but also with a firm hand and very high expectations. I kept a clean house. I made sure homework was done and dinner was on the table, and that we were at church every Sunday without fail. I was what people in those days called a good mother, and I believed that assessment. I worked hard to earn it. But there was a version of mothering I didn't know how to do, and that was the version where the mother extends to herself even a fraction of the grace she gives her children. When my children stumbled, I was patient with them. I sat with them. I told them that mistakes were how we learned, that they were still loved, that tomorrow was another day. I meant every word of it. And then I would close the bedroom door at night and mentally go through every single thing I had failed to do that day, every shortcoming, every moment where I had fallen short of the standard I had set for myself, and I would file each one away like evidence, not to learn from, to punish myself with. I didn't call it that, of course. I called it accountability. I called it not making excuses. I told myself that people who let themselves off the hook too easily were the ones who never improved, and I was very invested in the idea of constantly improving. The truth is, I was terrified. Terrified that if I stopped being hard on myself for even a moment, I would fall apart completely, or become someone careless, someone who didn't matter, someone who wasn't worth keeping around. The self-criticism wasn't discipline. It was fear wearing discipline's clothing. Gerald saw it before I did. He used to say, "Dot, you need to be a better friend to yourself." I'd smile and wave him off because I thought I understood what he meant, but didn't think it applied to me in any serious way. I was functioning perfectly well. I was doing everything that needed to be done. I didn't see what there was to be concerned about. Now I understand that functioning is not the same as living, and that doing everything that needs to be done can become the most elegant way of never having to look at what you're carrying. Gerald passed in 2009, and in the grief of losing him, I discovered something I hadn't expected, which was that I didn't know how to comfort myself at all. I knew how to keep going. I knew how to stay busy, to organize the funeral, to thank people for their casseroles, to hold myself together in public. But when I was alone in that house at night, I had no language for what I was feeling, no softness I could offer myself, no voice inside that said what I had spent decades saying to my children, which is that it's all right. You're going to be all right. You don't have to be strong every single second. That voice had never developed in me. I had starved it. I got through the grief the only way I knew how, which was to move through it as briskly as possible and keep being useful to other people. My daughter came to stay for a while. My grandchildren visited. I busied myself, and in a year or two, I was back to something that looked very much like myself. And I thought, well, you handled that. You got through it. Good for you. And I felt, underneath the relief, something I didn't fully identify at the time. A sadness that wasn't about Gerald at all. A sadness that was older than that. My granddaughter Mia was about 7 years old when the thing happened that I still think about almost every day. She was visiting me on a Saturday in late spring, and we were drawing together at the kitchen table, which was something she loved to do, and which I had begun to love too, because it was one of the few activities I had allowed myself where there was no correct outcome. She was drawing a picture of a horse. She was going through a phase where she drew nothing but horses, and at some point she made a line that she hadn't intended to make, and she sat back and looked at it, and I watched her face go through something. I watched a small shadow cross it. She looked at the drawing the way I had looked at myself in mirrors for most of my adult life, and then I heard her say, under her breath, in the quietest, most matter-of-fact tone, "You always mess it up." She was 7 years old. I put down my pencil. I sat there for a moment, and then I said to her very gently, "Who told you that?" She shrugged and said no one. She just always did. I asked her if she'd ever said something like that about her brother when he made a mistake, and she looked at me like I was a little bit strange and said, "Of course not. He didn't do it on purpose." I said, "Well, did you do it on purpose?" And she thought about it very carefully, the way children do, and she said no. And I said, "Then why would you speak to yourself in a way you'd never speak to him?" She didn't have an answer. She was 7. She had just learned from somewhere that her own mistakes deserved a harder response than anyone else's. And I sat at that kitchen table looking at my granddaughter and felt something break open in me very quietly, like a window that had been painted shut for so long you'd forgotten it was ever meant to open. I was 80 years old, and I was looking at a 7-year-old girl, and I was seeing myself at 7, and at 20, and at 45, and at 68, and I was understanding something that I had spent a lifetime building elaborate structures to avoid understanding, which was that I had never, not once, given myself the same basic decency I gave to everyone I loved. I had given it to my children freely. I had given it to Gerald. I had given it to friends in their difficult moments, to strangers, to neighbors I barely knew, but I had withheld it from myself with such consistency for such a long time that I had come to believe the withholding was a form of integrity. It wasn't integrity. It was a wound I had learned to call a virtue. I sat with Mia for a while after that, and we talked about the horse picture, and I told her it was beautiful, which it was, wrong line and all, and she seemed to accept that, the way children accept things when they come from someone they trust. But I was somewhere else in my mind. I was thinking about all the years. I was thinking about the 32-year-old woman in the photograph who I had felt nothing for, and I was finally feeling something. I was grieving her. I was grieving every version of myself that had worked so hard and asked for so little, and never once been told by the one person who was always there, by me, that she was doing well enough, that she was enough, that she didn't have to earn her place in her own life every single day. I want to be careful about how I say what I'm about to say, because I don't want it to sound like a simple lesson, because it wasn't simple, and it still isn't. I'm 84 years old, and I'm still working on it. I still catch myself some mornings going through what I did wrong the day before I've even had my coffee. The habit of self-punishment is one of the deepest grooves I've ever tried to step out of, because it was never presented to me as a bad habit. It was presented as how good people behave. It was presented as the alternative to being lazy or self-indulgent or weak. But here is what I know now that I wish someone had sat down and told me when I was young. There is nothing strong about refusing to be kind to yourself. It doesn't build character, it just builds walls. And eventually those walls keep out the very things you've worked your whole life to deserve. Peace and rest and the uncomplicated feeling of being enough. My granddaughter Mia is 15 now. She's bright and funny and still draws horses, though now she draws other things too. I don't know if she remembers that afternoon at my kitchen table, but I make a point, every single time I am with her, of saying the things out loud that I never heard and never said to myself. That it's all right to make a mistake, that a wrong line doesn't ruin the picture, that you don't have to be perfect to be worth loving. I say those things to her, and I mean them for her, but I'm also, finally, at 84, trying to mean them for me. If you are someone who has spent your life being the hardest on the person who needed your kindness the most, I'm not going to tell you it's easy to change that. It isn't. But I will tell you that it is possible to grieve what you never gave yourself and then begin, slowly, imperfectly, without any dramatic transformation, to give it now. Whatever years you have left, they belong to someone who deserves a little grace, someone who has earned it 100 times over and was never told so. You are not the exception to your own compassion. You never were.